Okay, so we want to welcome everybody to today's live meeting of the Manhattan Project. I'm Dennis Speed. Generally, people see me on a screen, but we're not doing that today, and increasingly, we hope we won't have to do that in that same way. Our meeting today, Mobilize for Peace Through Development. And I want to begin the meeting just by referring to a statement that was put out by our co-thinker organization in France and is being circulated here in the United States. Solidarity and Progress of France issued the statement, and then we've picked it up and we're also circulating it. They say, on July 28th and 29th, France and Saudi Arabia are convening a conference on a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine at the United Nations in New York. This conference has to create the framework for peace among Palestinians and Israelis, this time by arriving at concrete initiatives in coherence with the humanist principles of the Abrahamic traditions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, with international law and with the United Nations Charter. Today in the real world, transmitted by the world media, mankind is assisting directly in a horrible spectacle, that of an Israeli government that is, in the name of the right to, quote, defend itself against terrorism, committing war against humanity and barbaric acts akin to genocide. This government is kept artificially alive by the governments of Washington and London via the injection of billions of dollars and increasingly lethal weapons. In that context, recognizing and creating a Palestinian state is an absolute necessity. Giving it sovereignty over its water and energy resources will be one of the indispensable pillars to turn a dream, our proposal for an oasis plan of mutually beneficial development, into reality. This perspective has to be adopted to the benefit of all participants of Southwest Asia, who have to define its modalities and the means of its application. As early as 1975, American statesman and economist Lyndon LaRouche had proposed the Oasis Plan to address the geological realities relevant to the people of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, who inhabit an arid region located at the connection of three continents. The essential developments of water infrastructure to make the deserts bloom and transportation connectivity to allow the blossoming of trade and production were central to his vision of economic development plans required for political solutions to be reached. Such a plan is contrary to British geopolitics and colonial powers. The Oasis Plan approach defines a development perspective that goes, as it must do, beyond the plans of the World Bank, the French proposals, and those of the Arab League. The plan takes inspiration from the Reconciliation Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created by Nelson Mandela to overcome apartheid. The Schiller Institute calls for release of hostages and prisoners, immediate reinstatement of humanitarian aid and supply of water and electricity, and immediate recognition of a Palestinian state as a full member of the United Nations. The Oasis Plan is the cornerstone for creating a new paradigm of détente, entente, and cooperation. So that's the statement that we are presently circulating, it is being presently circulated in and around the United Nations and also internationally, and is an expression of a policy initiative and an ensemble of policy initiatives that Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Organization have advocated in one form or another for 50 years. To speak both to this, but also this in the context of the rapidly evolving strategic circumstance, we're going to first hear from Harley Schlanger, spokesman for LaRouche Institute, and speaking to us from Potsdam, Europe. You able to hear us, Harley?
Yes, I do. Do you hear me?
Yes. Okay. You're fine.
Okay. Well, the discussion of the two-state solution is one of the final phases of putting an end to the era of empire. What we're seeing unfold in Ukraine, the continued cases of civil war and hunger in Africa, and the slaughter going on in Gaza is an end of an imperial system, which should have been put out of business at the end of World War II had Franklin Roosevelt lived. But instead, we saw another 70, 80 years of imperial systems, in which case you have the remnants of empire. And the question of the two-state solution, I'll show, is an attempt to overcome a continuation of imperial policy. And the genocide going on in Palestine right now is the nature of the mindset of the empire, the emperors, in their desire to suppress any effort to end the imperial system. Now, I think Diane is going to go through the importance of the declassification of documents by Tulsi Gabbard. Let me simply say that when you're looking at what's going on in Ukraine, it's the same imperial system. And the lying and the fraud of the Russiagate case, which is now being exposed, is typical of how the empire works, to keep people ignorant, to keep people unaware of what the alternatives are. And I think when you hear what I have to say about the Southwest Asia, the Middle East situation, it will become clear that what we're dealing with is the end phase of a British empire in the current phase operating out of the establishment of Washington, D.C., New York, and the city of London. Now, the deeper issue in the Gabbard case, the Gabbard declassification, is the same as what I'm going to be discussing, which is the role of the British in shaping a policy which leads to genocide. And so we start, you just heard the statement from Jacques Cheminade. There's a conference coming up to discuss the two-state solution. And the two-state solution, I'll go through this in a moment, but what it means is the recognition of a Palestinian state, not as some kind of virtual reality, but a state that can function, that can provide for the health care and the food needs and the transportation and the work that's necessary for a nation to be successful. And so the fight is to complete the period of the American Revolution, which was launched 250 years ago. Now, I'm going to start with the background to the two-state solution. If I could have the first map, please. Now, this is a map of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was centered in Turkey. It was 400 years in existence, and you can see that it has its tentacles into North Africa, into Europe and the Balkans, into Central Asia, and throughout what's known as the Middle East. Now, this was the peak of the Ottoman Empire, just before the end of the 19th century. The question that was posed to the British, the French, and the European imperial countries was, could they replace the Ottomans? Because if you look at the map, what you see is you have water, you've got the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea. All of these are connection points that connect Africa, Europe, and Asia. And in the hands of the Turks, the British were not able to take full advantage of that. But their goal was to bring down the Ottoman Empire and to control the choke points, the ports, the land routes for the empire as a way to control the financial system overall. Now, let me have the next map, please. Now, this is at the end of, or at the beginning of World War I. You see that it still was fairly significant. But at this point, you had a British footprint in Egypt and a strategy of the British to replace the Ottomans throughout the whole region. Now, keep in mind, this was before oil was so important. It was not unimportant, but this wasn't primarily about oil. It was about geographical strategic control. Now, as the British began to contemplate how to break this power, what was done was a declaration on November 2nd, 1917, by Lord Alfred Balfour. Could I have the photo, please? Balfour was the foreign minister of the United Kingdom, and he issued a very short letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, the head of the Zionist movement in Great Britain. It's a short letter. What he wrote was, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now, keep in mind, this was territory that was under the control of the Turks at that point. The British didn't run it, they didn't control it, but they were moving in using the end of World War I to prepare for the post-war period and the expansion of the control of the British Empire. Now, later on in this short letter, he said, nothing shall be done with the Jewish homeland, which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, what did he mean by that? Non-Jewish communities. Well, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, there were 60,000 Jews living in Palestine, 60,000, and 600,000 non-Jews that included Muslims, Christians, and also Arab Jews. These were people who were considered almost non-people by the British Empire. So he said, we're not going to prejudice their civil and religious rights, but they're not going to have a homeland. This will be a Jewish homeland. Now, it was clear at the same time that the British goal was to bring in large numbers of Jewish immigrants to expand the size of the population. The slogan that the Zionists had at that time was, this is a land without people for a people without land. But the question then was, what would happen to the existing Arab population that lived there? Now, among those who made comments on this was Winston Churchill, who said at a 1921 meeting of the Imperial Cabinet, we will not turn or not tear the Arab off his land and invade his political and social rights. So he made reference to the rights of the non-Jewish Arab population. But this was an afterthought. The reality was that the establishment of a Zionist state, and it didn't say state, keep in mind it said homeland, but the reality is that the intention was to create a British operation in the region that would serve the role of the British Empire. Now, from 1923 to 1948, there was what was called the British Mandate. That is a mandate given by the League of Nations to the British to prepare the region for self-government. That was the statement in the mandate. In reality, it pitted two different nationalist forces. The Zionists were not religious. The Zionists were a nationalist force, a Jewish nationalist force, and they were pitted against an Arab nationalist grouping. Now, this came to a head in 1948, but before that, you had the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 39. You had the Jewish terrorism with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, Begin and Shamir, killing British between 1944 and 1948. In 1948, you had the beginnings of an Israeli army. You also had Arab armies that had been somewhat trained and equipped by the British, but the Israeli army was much more prepared for what happened. And so on May 15th, 1948, when the state of Israel was declared by the United Nations as a state, it was recognized as a state, the Arabs did not do the same and declare an Arab state in Palestine. Instead, they launched an invasion. And it was an invasion that turned out badly for the Arab neighbors. But not only for them, the killing of the Palestinian population was an extraordinary moment when a Jewish army was killing a population and scaring them, driving them off. It's known as the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe, where the Palestinian people were driven from their homes. 700 to 750,000 people lost their homes in what had been Palestine. Now, and by the way, many of them had to move to refugee camps. And to this day, some of the people involved with the Arab resistance are great-grandchildren of the people who were made to flee in 1948 in the face of the attacking Israeli army. Now, the question then became, what are you going to do with this population? Would there be an opportunity for them to have a state, because they were not given much power or influence in Israel? Israel was set up as a Zionist state. 70% of the land of the mandate ended up in the hands of Israel. So only 22% of the total land was available for an Arab state. And so it's not surprising that the Arabs rejected the idea of a state in 1948. But from 1948 forward, there was a commitment to the idea of a two-state solution, that eventually there will be a Palestinian state, an Arab state, that would live side by side with Israel. Now, there were also several more wars, including the '67 war, in which the Israelis crushed the Arab armies and took back land that included Gaza, the West Bank of the Jordan River, greatly expanding the territory of Israel. And this is what's known today as still the occupied territories. There was one attempt to rectify this under the principle of land for peace, and that was the Oslo Agreement, where Rabin, according to his wife, Rabin realized that the Jews in Israel could not live as oppressors and needed to provide a legitimate space for the Arab population. But this was not fulfilled, it was not carried out, because the problem was that there was a split between the so-called political solution and the economic solution. As Lyndon LaRouche made clear, you could not have a political solution unless there was a way to make the Palestinian state economically feasible. Rabin tried to do that with the Oslo Annex, the Accords, the Annex to the Accords, which included the idea of water, power, industrial sharing, technology sharing. But that would have required an international movement to provide funds to do it. And those funds were never made available. The Israelis, as it turns out, other than Rabin and some of the people immediately around him, had no intention of returning the land. And so what you had was a continuation of what is called a settler colonial movement, with the idea of taking and holding the land as much as possible. Now, I'm just going to go through briefly an example of this, which shows that the ethnic cleansing going on in Gaza today is not new. It was not only the after effect of the war of 1948, but actually a conscious policy by the government of Israel to eliminate the idea of a Palestinian people. I'm going to be quoting from a book which was written by a deputy mayor of Jerusalem. And when you hear what he had to say, you'll see this was a different kind of Israeli than what we see today. A man named Meron Ben-Vinisti. He wrote a book called Sacred Landscape, The Buried History of the Holy Land Since 1948. It's a book about his father, David Ben-Vinisti, who was appointed by the Zionist government to literally rewrite the map of the Holy Land. The idea was that you have to produce what he called a Hebrew map of the lands, and that this would serve as a renewed title deed, using the map to make the existence of Israel the only acceptable reality in world politics. Now, Benveniste said his father said this would be a renewed title deed. The purpose was to inculcate his children and countless other young Israelis with the Zionist ethos of Moladet, which is homeland, that is knowledge of its glorious Jewish past, intimate communion with its nature, and personal commitment to pioneering in collective agricultural settlements. But there was no room in those settlements for the Arab population. And what Benveniste writes is that the map making was so successful that it erased the old landscape, which had been dotted by many, many Arab villages. Now, there were 531 Palestinian towns and villages which were obliterated in the War of 1948. That is, small villages where Palestinian farmers could no longer stay. They lost the land. They heard about the massacres at Deir Yassin and others, and they were afraid they would be next, so they left. What Ben-Gvir calls a voluntary transfer. Well, it was voluntary in that they were trying to save their lives and their families' lives. These towns were removed from the maps and replaced by towns with Hebrew names. And the idea, as he said his father had, was to make sure that people did not know there had been a Palestinian past. Now, the goal, as his father said, was to make the idea of an Arab presence in a land called Palestine nothing but a piece of propaganda, to wipe out a people, the historic memory of a people. Now, this became one of the centers of Zionist propaganda. After the Six-Day War, 2 years afterwards, at a commemoration, Golda Meir, who called herself a Palestinian, by the way, Palestinian from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but Golda Meir, in an interview, said, there was no such thing as Palestinians, following up the blotting out of the historic memory of a population by war, by terror, and by map making. This same statement was repeated by Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the extremist Greater Israel faction in the Netanyahu government. In March 2023, Smotrich said at a rally in the occupied territories, by the way, where he lived, he said, there's no such thing as Palestinians. And that's the intent of ethnic cleansing. It's not merely just to drive them out, but to create what Ariel Sharon called facts on the ground. That is, areas where Israeli settlers can move in and take over the land, break up the land of the mandate that had been set aside for a Palestinian state, so you could not have a Palestinian state. You would have, in a sense, the idea of Bantustans, like they had in South Africa, small villages, but with no connection to each other, no communication, no roads. And that's one of the reasons that people refer to Israel as an apartheid state, that the breaking up of the land that was set aside for the Palestinians, for a Palestinian state, is not contiguous. It can't function. And increasingly, that land is being appropriated by the settler movement. There were in 19, let me see if I have this figure here. Well, the settlements in the West Bank have grown astronomically. And what we're seeing is a continued terror campaign against Palestinian farmers to drive them out. And the administration of those lands has been taken away from the Palestinian Authority and put in the hands not of the Israel Defense Forces or of the local police and civil administration, but in the hands of the settlers who settle disputes with guns and knives and rocks and beatings. And now the Israeli government is annexing that land, which they call the Israeli Sovereignty Movement, probably trying to get support from the MAGA people in the United States. Now, when you realize then that the ethnic cleansing today that's going on to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, to drive them out of the West Bank, to drive them out of East Jerusalem, this is part of a long-standing plan being carried out by Zionists, but for what purpose? On behalf of this old imperial geopolitical tradition. And what's being targeted is not just the Palestinians, but other sovereign nations in the region, including Egypt, where Egypt joined the BRICS, Ethiopia joined the BRICS, Iran joined the BRICS, that is the alliance that was set up by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as an alternative to the collapsing imperial system. Well, instead, you've imposed war in this region, a war of each against all, and made it a situation where the idea of human life is no longer sacred. If you have a government which can deliberately starve a population, as the government of Israel is doing to the Palestinians, and then justify it and say that they're animals, these are children that are going to grow up to be terrorists. We have no empathy with them, or even as Smotrich said, we don't believe there's such a thing as Palestinians. And then say, look, we'll let you move to some other place. Well, who gave that power to the people of Israel? In fact, the two-state solution starts from the standpoint that there must be a commitment to creating a livable state. Now, I just want to finish a couple quotes from Benveniste before I wrap it up, because what you can see from this book that he wrote, it was a painful coming to grips with what Israel had become, that it was not the civilized, democratic oasis in the midst of Arab barbarism, but it was in fact an imperial outpost designed to destroy the potential for people to live in peace. And he writes about the irony that the Jewish people claimed the right to move to Palestine to fulfill a biblical injunction to be a blessing unto mankind, but denying the homeland to the people who already lived there. And here's what he said. Do we have a special responsibility, if only because we turned out to be the victors? What have we done to the vanquished enemy? Have we transformed a struggle for survival into an ethnic cleansing operation, sending another people to exile because we wanted to plunder their land? The war we fought was cruel to both sides, but have we not actually prolonged the state of war so that we might suspend human values indefinitely? Now, he concluded by saying that the solution is not merely a question of giving land to the Palestinians. And he said, nor should we just recognize the Palestinians as victims. That's not the basis for peace. What is necessary, he wrote, is to provide economic justice to the Palestinians in the form of providing water and electricity, schools, healthcare, and housing. And he said that the government should sell off some of the agricultural land to compensate the original Arab owners to allow the right to return, because the Arabs who were driven out in 1948 have not been allowed back into their old lands. And so he said, to do this would not just be a righteous act, that is to compensate them and allow them back, but it might also signify that Israel was no longer evading its responsibilities. Now that's the mentality that was behind Rabin's Oslo Accord. And there were, in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century, there were Israelis who wanted to see this kind of peace, but not enough. And they were not supported by the United States, by the Europeans, or by the British. Instead, what was supported was the policy of ethnic cleansing and control. And so we have the facts on the ground, almost 80 years now, of denial of rights to the Palestinians, denial of all rights, including the right to life. This is the old paradigm of geopolitics. That's what the two-state solution must end. And what that means is that you can take the statement that Dennis read at the beginning, print it out, circulate it. This is a matter of not just survival for Palestinians, but survival for the whole world. Will we act as the victors who treat the vanquished as non-humans, who take away all their rights, including the right to live? Or do we intend to establish a more human civilization, one with empathy for all people? Sovereignty means nothing unless the goal of a sovereign government is to take care of the needs of its people, including those who have the biggest needs, but to do so with a collaboration with neighbors, with other countries, to bring about an era of peace and prosperity. That's what the two-state solution represents. It's not just a slogan. It's not just a good idea. It's a necessity. And the conference coming up next week, I hate to say it, but I think it's probably going to stop short of establishing a Palestinian state. We had the spectacle of Macron, who's quite capable of changing his mind. But Macron, 2 days ago, said that France will now support the establishment of a Palestinian state. But it's not just a question of naming a state and accepting it. What has to be done is provide the basis for that state to survive and prosper. And that's what this fight is all about. And that's why we have to put an end to this 19th century geopolitical imperial model, which is being carried out through a brutal genocide right now in Gaza and the West Bank.
Thanks. That's okay. Yeah, Jess. So, Harley, what we're going to do, where is it? Yeah, okay. So what we're going to do is just go right to questions for you, because we know you have a short period of time. I want to bring up one matter to get us started, because yesterday, 30 years ago, July 25th, 1995, was the occasion of the meeting at the White House with Clinton, Yitzhak Rabin, and that's the one in which he gave the toast. If I raise my toast, I will raise it for those who have the courage to change axioms, to overcome prejudices, to change realities, to all those who believe and support and are ready to assist the continuation of peace in the region. L'chaim. He was dead, assassinated by November 4th of the same year, 30 years ago. Said to be, of course, assassinated by a lone assassin, Israeli lone assassin, and the next year, Benjamin Netanyahu came to power. Netanyahu, a well-known opponent of Yitzhak Rabin. Could you say something about what Rabin was doing, what his assassination meant, since I think this is part of what we call the Assassination Bureau's work, and let me just start off like that and see if you have some comments on that.
Sure. Well, according to Rabin's widow, Leah Rabin, he'd come to realize that Israel could not survive by militarily suppressing the Palestinian population, which was about an equal size of the Jewish population of Israel. Now, Rabin himself had come up through the Israel Defense Forces He was one of the leaders of the victory in 1967 and 73. But by the 80s, you had this constant pressure from the Palestinian population mobilizing, demanding their rights. And in 1987, there was something called the Intifada, which was an organized resistance. And Rabin was brought back to the army and was told he has to suppress it. And not to kill people, at least not on camera. But Rabin supposedly said, we have to break their bones and discourage them from demonstrating. Now, this is what's called the Iron Wall theory of the Jabotinsky movement, which is the predecessor to Netanyahu's party. And what it basically says is the only time you can give the Arabs actual rights is once they've been so thoroughly demoralized and beaten down that they will accept their oppression. And that's not a peace strategy. And all the efforts, the many Israeli governments said, well, we want peace, however, on our terms. And those terms were the terms of the Iron Wall. So Rabin, by 1992 and 93, got elected prime minister. He'd been prime minister briefly in the 70s, didn't work out too well. But this time, it was a moment when he saw a possibility for change. And what he did is he hooked up with his old opponent inside the Labor Party, Shimon Peres, and agreed to launch a back-channel negotiation with Yasser Arafat in Oslo, Norway. And that's where the Oslo Accord came from. And what it basically said is that we'll give you political rights. We'll trade some of the land. We'll give you back some of the land in return for you recognizing Israel and giving up terrorism. Arafat agreed. Arafat and Rabin both said, we've buried too many of our youth to continue this. And so they decided they had to have a political solution. But what was clear is a political solution doesn't work when you've had this cycle of vengeance for decades. And so Rabin included in the Oslo Accord these economic annexes, which included water projects, joint power projects, small industry, agricultural projects, energy sharing. And what LaRouche saw in this was what he had presented in 1975, which is an oasis plan. Pool the resources together to take the most advanced desalination policy, to take the salt out of the water, build a series of canals to do that so that there's water available for all the nations in that region, including Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And this was the direction that Rabin was going in. The problem was Bill Clinton didn't give him the backing that was needed. And the line coming from the international financial community was, you can't trust Arafat, the PLO is corrupt, so we can't give them money to do this. And so there was a period of time where the hope was still there, but it was being lost. And Rabin was in the process of remotivating his base when he was assassinated. Now, the person who shot him was inspired by the anti-Oslo movement that was headed literally by Netanyahu. And the death of Rabin shocked everyone, but it ended this idea of the courage to change axioms. And it was written in the history books as just another example of how hard it is to change the situation. Now, I think the important lesson is that what LaRouche had said all along, if you want to change the political environment, go with an economic policy of mutual benefit. Provide incentives to the poor Palestinians, to the young Israelis, to work together for a better future. And that's the basis on which you can solve the other problems, the political problems, such as who's going to have what land, who's going to have political control over Jerusalem. How are you going to bring back the Palestinians who lost their land? How do you have justice? if you have a poor population which has no hope for the future. And so that's why the Oasis plan of LaRouche would have been the bigger picture within which the Oslo plan would have worked. Now, that was 30 years ago. I think that's right, yeah, 30-something years ago. This is where we have to go today. There's no reason not to. And if you look at what the BRICS represent, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, if you look at the water and power projects that the Chinese and the Russians are building in Africa, why not do that in Southwest Asia? And instead of building a Disneyland casino resort in Gaza, how about making it a livable space for the people who can raise their families there without the fear that they're going to get a drone attack or a hospital blown up when they close their eyes at night to go to sleep? So that's what the importance is of this meeting coming up next week, to at least begin the process of discussion. But it's going to require a mobilization of people in the West, people who so far have not shown the inclination to provide the love of their fellow man to overcome the power of the evil of the imperial oligarchs.
I have a question, comment from the audience here. Go ahead, sir.
I'm discouraged by all this. I mean, this is very educational, and the discussions are as if no one was aware of all these wonderful ways of reorganizing the world in a better way. But the fact is that in every nation state involved, there are 15 to 20 people who determine what goes on in the interest of whoever own that nation state. And nothing is going to happen to change that. And none of these discussions are ever going to resolve anything real, because it's not in the interest of those who own things, control things, to make that happen. Even if you educate 85% of the population of every state to realize, oh my God, it's wrong, it won't make a difference. We know that in this country, at least, the will of the majority has zero influence on what happens in terms of legislation and economic structure. You know, that 80% of the people in this country want a national health plan. They've always wanted it. It hasn't happened. It's never going to happen. It's not in the interest of those MPs to have such a plan. It's not in the interest of reorganizing the Middle East, in the interest of those who don't want that kind of reorganization. And LaRouche's plan, and your plan, and Curry's plan are wonderful. You said the Schiller Institute calls for, and you list a whole lot of things. Upon whom is it calling to make these changes? And why will they listen? They will not. There's a passage in Shakespeare's where, someone claims he can call spirits from the next deep, and Hotspur says, yeah, call them, but will they come? So you could call upon all these interests to change things. Why will they do it? They don't have to.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this is like the favorite question. The favorite question that several of us here have. I'll start off with me, just because I can't resist. I love this question. It's simple. You organize a conspiracy. The problem involved is Americans are no longer Americans. They forgot Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin organized the most successful conspiracy in human history. From the time he was 16 years old, when he was deployed to Philadelphia to organize it by the Mather family, which sent him to Philadelphia to organize the conspiracy. He called it the junto. Junta, like coup, that's what Franklin called it. And he started from the age of 16 to organize that conspiracy. It took him 54 years to get it together enough to meet in Philadelphia to do what it had to do. But it worked. And no one believed it could work, because it was the largest military force on the planet against whom they were arrayed. But the problem was the conspiracy was too well organized for the British, because their own military commanders, the Howe brothers, had a sister who was part of Franklin's network, not that she supported the American Revolution, but because Franklin used to play chess with her in certain circumstance, which we won't discuss. She was part of the network. Franklin had people like, well, there were people like Benjamin West, there were many other people, artists. The artists were part of it. They were stationed in London, like Benjamin West, who ran the American school there. And when John Trumbull, who had been at Bunker Hill as a young man, a commander from Connecticut, went to London and did the first known portrait of Washington, he was almost killed there because of the killing of Benedict Arnold. These are more intricate stories I can't get into right now to tell you the details. But the important point is that Benjamin West went to George III and saved the life of John Trumbull because he could. Because that's how deeply Franklin's networks were ensconced inside of the oligarchy. But Franklin was able to do that because he was a scientist. In fact, he was one of the most famous scientists in the world as a result of his work on electricity. And because of that, and also because of his earlier contact with various scientific networks all over the world, had organized an international conspiracy. Germans, Italians, the French, the Polish, obviously the French. That's what the American Revolution was. It had nothing to do with taxes. It was related to taxes, but it had nothing to do with it. It was organized and it was fomented as an international conspiracy, which is why Americans have been trained to never use the word conspiracy. Americans are told conspiracy theory. What about conspiracy practice? So we are not conspiracy theorists, we are conspiracy practitioners. We know that because that's the way everything has been done in history. We're trying to do something which is different than that by actually getting the American people as a whole to take this sort of thing up. And so no, you can't, because Harley's going to answer it, and Diana's going to kill me if I don't sit down because she wants to answer it. No, this is the question. This is perfect. This is the question we love to get. Because here you ask who we are addressing it to. You. You quoted Shakespeare, now I will quote Shakespeare to you. The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. The last part is the important part, the 4 words, that we are underlings, subjects, not citizens. The American people are no longer citizens, and therefore they don't believe, quote unquote, I don't know how to do this. So the point of the thing is, the idea here is the citizens have an obligation to the people of Gaza. The citizens have an obligation to the people of Ukraine, for that matter. The citizens have the obligation to implement what we're talking about. That's who we're talking to. And sometimes you'll get a citizen soldier who serves in the Congress who surprises you, like Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah. So guess what? We have the means, the opportunity, and the motive to commit the crime of conspiracy. The question is, do we have the guts? Okay, that's what I got to say about it. Harley, you want to go next?
I'll just take it something from Shakespeare also. To be or not to be, that is the question. And I think, Dennis, you gave a fairly good compelling argument to be that what we're looking at is something that most people try to avoid. And the Rabin quote you read earlier is crucial to that. The courage to change axioms, not sticking with what people believe, being able to go out on a limb and take a stand and know that you're right and know that there's a higher law, a higher creative process that determines the outcome of these kinds of struggles. So the question is, are you going to be a part of that? Or will you sit back and say, I don't see how we can win this fight? And the example you gave of Franklin and the American Revolution, because of the quality of leadership of Franklin, George Washington, a very young man named Alexander Hamilton, who served as the aide-de-camp to George Washington, they inspired a fairly ragtag bunch. But what did they inspire them around? Philosophical, scientific ideas. If you read the Federalist Papers, for example, you might find it hard to get through it initially. These are complex questions that were taken up in barroom and taverns, as opposed to which sports team to cheer for. So that the question of deciding to become part of a conspiracy for the good, I would say it starts with reading through and studying the fundamental principles that Helga Zepp LaRouche prepared as a discussion paper for the new paradigm that's coming into existence. Now, for those of you who are new to this, here's something you should think about. People like Dennis and me have been at this for more than 50 years, like Franklin. But we're coming to a point where these ideas that we've been fighting to bring to life are now becoming obvious or more clear, let's say, to anyone who's willing to open their eyes and open their hearts with love for the human race. And so the question then is to have the courage to change axioms, have the courage to be a part of the solution, and not duck under the covers when the first time you hear a negative word. And it is a rough fight. I mean, the benefit that Dennis and I and the older members of our organization have, including some of the relatively younger, older members, is the experience of working with Lyndon LaRouche. But thanks to videotape, thanks to collection of articles and speeches by LaRouche, you can have access to that as well. And I can assure you that every week as I sit down to prepare something for the Manhattan Town Meeting, I'm looking at something from Lyndon LaRouche for inspiration. And generally, it's something that catches you by surprise, something you may have read and missed previously. And oftentimes, it's from the grave, a kick in the butt from Lyndon LaRouche. But if that's what's needed, good. You know where to find it. But we have to make sure that this fight is carried through to the end. And now with the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, this is an ideal time to educate our fellow citizens. And if you think it's tough in the United States, you should try it here in Germany, where people are listening to a repeat from their leaders of the Nazi ideology that led Germans to march to Stalingrad and Leningrad and elsewhere in World War II. So take heart, the fight is there to win, and there's nothing better to do with your life than to challenge the part of you that wants to sit back and say, who's going to do it? Well, if not you, who?
Thanks, Harley. Thank you for that, Harley. What we'll do is take this as the opportunity to make a transition to Diane, who is certainly going to answer that question, but also because of the occasion that brought us here. Diane is the president of the LaRouche Organization, and of course, we're trying to talk about the solution, as we have already been doing. So let me get out of her way, because she will do her job.
I hope so.
That's going to happen.
Well, just on your question, I think they're also, first of all, we are in a really different place than people living in China, for example, which has 1.4 billion people. And Americans have a very, very hard time not thinking that the entire planet is what we experience and see in the United States, even though we're only 4% of the world's population. So first of all, I don't know, 60 to 85% of the world's population is not going along with the type of system that that our so-called leaders are perpetrating right now. China got 850 million people out of grinding, horrible poverty. And if you go there, as my husband and I did in 2023, young Chinese actually laugh. They say, you know, these people in the West think they're going to get us to overthrow our government. They say, we don't want to overthrow our government. We like our government. We trust our government. We knew our parents grew up in a house with no running water, no electricity, and 7 of us in one room. And now every one of us has our own house. And, you know, they don't feel, and it's very ironic because while you don't elect the top leadership of China, you do have municipal elections and lower level elections, but nonetheless, the people that we spoke with in China, including our Uber drivers, and we were not prevented from talking to people, felt much more like they had an influence over their government than Americans feel that we have over our government. And think about that. So first of all, actually the world has very much changed, and we might think about these conflicts not as the dominant system, but as the system that's on its way out, that is totally bankrupt, and that is prepared to unleash horrors, including thermonuclear annihilation, because that's the only way you're going to actually stop 5 or 6 billion people who are moving on to a different system. Do we have the, I don't know if you'd call it guts? Are we insane enough to go to nuclear war? Apparently there are some people in Washington who think that, as Tucker Carlson reported when Biden was sending the long-range missiles to Ukraine, that some people at the Pentagon said there was a 50% chance that would lead to nuclear war, and the Biden administration thought that was acceptable. But I don't know. So we are already in a very different place. It's just the news hasn't gotten here. Sort of like Juneteenth, the news that the slaves had been freed was not allowed to get to the South for quite some time. So 1, we should remember that. 2, I always think about the Berlin Wall because Erich Honecker had given these speeches about socialism is going to last, we're going to have a Reich, it's going to last 1,000 years. And 10 days later, he's on an airplane fleeing for his life, and the Berlin Wall is down. And there was a great opportunity. And what led to that was the bankruptcy of the system. People waiting in long, long, long lines for toilet paper, coffee, this, that, and a feeling of oppression that they decided was no longer acceptable. So the problem with this minority that seems to be so powerful, or the problem they have, is that what they are doing flies in the face of natural law, and it flies in the face of human identity. And as Schiller said, there's a limit to a tyrant's power. There's a point where this gives. And the pathway in which it unfolds is shaped by the ideas that are presented by the conspiracies that are organized. So we had 2 examples of that around the time of the American Revolution. That was one conspiracy, which actually went back to Nicholas of Cusa, Joan of Arc, Erasmus, St. Augustine, the Mathers, a conspiracy to create a government that was based on the concept that every single human being was created equal, and therefore someone wasn't designed to rule over you by their bloodline, and that the government's obligation was to protect the right of each person to develop their creative potential, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the principle of the general welfare. This was long-ranging. It was educated. It was not, oh, we're having a revolution. Oh, the British are charging taxes. This is what was going on. It was centuries in the work. Then in Europe, they thought they were going to have a revolution. The French, the Marquis de Lafayette was there, but it failed. It failed. It got off track, and there was a British conspiracy to bring in the bankers and to get everyone screaming and yelling on the lowest possible level. Look how the royals are spending their money, and then probably a bad idea that you could have a republic with a monarchy. And what ended up happening were mobs of people and the head chopping, and it didn't work. It just led to a massive amount of bloodshed. But as Schiller said, Friedrich Schiller's view, the reason he wrote the Letters on the Aesthetical Education of Man is he said you had a moment which was a revolutionary moment where a horrible system potentially could be ended, but the people were too small to take advantage of the moment. The people were too backwards, and he actually said that it's the role of the artist, to ennoble the people so that when you have a moment where the old rotten criminal system, which flies in the face of natural law, has collapsed, that the population is prepared to move to a new and better system. And that, in part, is very much why we want this OASIS plan circulating everywhere. We've been talking about this for 50 years, or LaRouche has been. I haven't been, but LaRouche has been talking about it for 50 years. It's been on the table. When is the moment where that can take effect? And I consider these things as sort of like you create a pathway for an orbit. There's something that, or a dam where you're directing the water when the dam breaks. That's the job of the citizenry. That's the job of the mass movement. That's why, in my opinion, there is never a wasted word or a wasted conversation, because you don't know when the person that seemed like a brick wall that you were trying to organize is the brick wall is going to be hit by a wrecking ball or something else, and suddenly what you told them over and over and over again that they didn't hear will take effect. So that's what we're confronted with, and we don't actually have in our control when it's going to break, when we're going to be able to do this. I happen to think that the horror that we're seeing and the gut-wrenched state of people because of seeing the starvation in Gaza now on your cell phone every time you turn, maybe that is the thing that is going to finally make people say enough already. And I'll get to that, because we actually should be a little bit uncomfortable about how we allowed ourselves to be at this point. Now, what Harley said, I'm just going to take up a little bit, because the Tulsi Gabbard revelations are part of this. And for everyone, to bring everyone up to date, the first thing that she released was documents showing that at 3 separate points at least, the intelligence community and different agencies had determined that Russia was not interested in and was not capable of cyber hacking the 2016 election. And it was August 31st, September 9th, and then after the election, December 7th. And then what she found is that there was a president's daily brief. The director of national intelligence at the time was James Clapper. Clapper or someone under him, had given the orders to suppress the daily brief from the president on December 8th, which said, it is our assessment that the Russians are not hacking the election and they don't have the capability or interest to do it. That wasn't given, but the next day there was a meeting convened at the Obama White House, which involved John Brennan, James Clapper, James Comey, Victoria Nuland, Susan Rice, John Kerry, some other people I never heard of, and that Obama personally gave the order for them to put out a narrative that they all knew was contrary to their findings and say that the Russians had caused the outcome of this election. And then a few days later, Gabbard released this document, which I just started reading. This is the Oversight, Investigation, and Referral, 18th of September 2020. This was done while Trump was still in office. And for reasons which I think should be explained, nothing was ever done with the findings in here. And frankly, it gets a bit tedious because they repeat over and over and over again that the intelligence community assessment, which was that Russia had meddled in or hacked the election, was not credible, and that various people in the intelligence agency said it was flawed, including Mike Rogers, who was then director of the NSA. So also the story that we heard, 17 intelligence agencies agree, was not even true at the time, and they knew it wasn't true. And then I'll just take this little section here. This is from their assessment in 2020. These failures were serious enough to call into question judgments that allege Putin, quote, this is from the intelligence community assessment, developed a clear preference for candidate Trump and aspired to help his chances of victory, and that Russian leaders never entirely abandoned hope for a defeat of Secretary Clinton, unquote. That was a quote from the intelligence community assessment. And then they say, then the quote is from the intelligence community assessment. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for Trump. We have high confidence in these judgments. CIA and FBI assess with high confidence that Putin and the Russian government aspired to help, blah, blah. So the intelligence community, even when they put this out, found the following problems that were below intelligence community standards. They say they did not properly describe the quality and credibility of underlying sources. They failed to properly express and explain uncertainties associated with major analytic judgments. They did not base confidence assessments on the quality and quantity of quality of source material. They were not informed by all relevant information available. They failed to consider alternative perspectives and contrary information, and they were not independent of political considerations. So aside from all of those failures, the intelligence was fantastic. Now, this was produced in September of 2020. And what else is in here is that what the intelligence community determined was that actually the Russians preferred for Hillary Clinton to get elected because they had a whole ton of stuff on her, because they had gotten access to DNC communications or whatever, and what they knew of her, you probably heard in Tulsi Gabbard's press conference, was that Hillary Clinton was having serious emotional issues, that she was both crying and then excessively cheerful, that she had, I forget what, diabetes and this and that and the other thing. Oh, here it is. So here is what the Russians had, which they wanted to use after Hillary Clinton won the election, because their idea, according to the intelligence community, was they could use all this material on Hillary to control her presidency. Can we leave that open for the air a little bit? So they say this is what our intelligence community knows that the Russian intelligence community has from the DNC. President Obama and party leaders found the state of Secretary Clinton's health to be extraordinarily alarming and felt it, and I'm wondering, is it possible for the Democratic Party to find anybody who's young and healthy ever to run for office? They always, anyway, but aside from that, and felt it could have a serious negative effect on her election prospects. She was suffering from, quote, intensified psycho-emotional problems, including uncontrolled fits of anger, aggression, and cheerfulness. And that therefore she was placed on a daily regimen of quote unquote heavy tranquilizers. And while afraid of losing, she remained, quote, obsessed with thirst for power, unquote. They also knew that she had type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, deep vein thrombosis, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, unquote. Okay, so this was known, and the Russians knew this, and our intelligence community knew this, documented this in 2020, and no one was prosecuted. And I want to say something about why this is important. It's not merely that they attempted to or wanted to steal the election from Trump, or that the British were calling for Trump to be assassinated. And it's unfortunate that if you're in the Trump administration, as everyone knows, the only way to get Trump's attention is to basically say that he is the second coming of Jesus Christ, and then if you say that, he will respond to what you're saying, and he will listen to it. So unfortunately, it colors the way these things are presented. But my point is that the purpose of this was to do what? To prevent Trump from normalizing relations with Russia. If you remember December after the election, what did the Obama administration do? They launched a whole new round of sanctions. They seized all these Russian property. And I remember reading somewhere that someone in the Obama administration actually said, we don't need a reason for this. If we take these really harsh actions against Russia, people will believe we have evidence on what they did. So it was, and they created a situation where Trump came in and could not talk to the Russians, although he tried. And if you remember the meeting he had with Putin in Finland or wherever it was, it was Helsinki. I thought they were going to stop waterboarding the translators because they said, how dare they have a secret conversation? Everyone has to know, blah, blah, blah. And then Trump said that he trusted the Russians more than the American intelligence community. And heads exploded. And now you can see why, because we now know that the intelligence community knew the entire time. Well, is it a crime to create the conditions where two nuclear superpowers move toward a thermonuclear war by telling lies? Is it a crime to kill 1 million Iraqis and 5,000 plus American service members and 5,000 American contractors and have 22 soldiers dying of suicide per day based on a lie? Is that criminal? So this is what we are looking at, and I will say that if we don't rectify this, and if heads don't roll, and if there are not some people put on trial and sent to prison over this, we will lose it will be gone, because that means that everything that we do will then be based on what Steve addressed, which is the 15 people who make up their crap, and then we're all supposed to do it. Now, if we don't annihilate the world, then the second worst option is we just become irrelevant, because they're moving on. They're building a transcontinental railroad across South Africa. They're building major economic infrastructure. The BRICS process is now 10 nations. 65% of their trade is in their own national currencies. 90% of Russia's trade is in other national currencies. So will we just become an irrelevant junk heap of impoverished, crazy, degenerate people? I don't know. Or will we blow up the world? Hopefully, we will be good enough to change the direction. And what I would like to bring up, and partly it's why I wore this insect today, if people may know, this is a scarab, and Lynn gave this to me some years ago. Scarabs are famous. It's not just they're associated with corpses, but apparently Apparently, they were greatly revered in ancient Egypt. And the reason is because the way they reproduce is they roll up little balls of dung, and they lay their eggs in the dung in these little balls, and then the eggs hatch, and you have new life that comes out of this pile of crap. And so I was thinking, well, isn't that sort of what we have to do, is we have to take this horrible pile of crap that we are in. I mean, first of all, we have to face that that's what we're in, which is why I want to go through this list, which I find somewhat, we have to be a little uncomfortable about this, and then move to a new paradigm. People are right to be anguished and in motion and in the streets because of the genocide that the Israeli regime with our tax dollars and weapons is perpetuating against the people of Gaza. But let's just reflect a minute on what has happened, and don't even have everything, since 1945 and when we said never again. How about the Vietnam War? That was, no one seems to really know, between 1.3 million and 3 million Vietnamese dead and 58,000 Americans dead, and also collateral damage or whatever, 970,000 or 275,000 dead Cambodians and 40,000 dead people in Laos. And in Laos, to this day, the landmines that we dumped there are still exploding, and they kill from 5 to 10 children per year in that country. That's the leftover of that activity. Or we have 1975, another 1.5 million people in Cambodia who died under Pol Pot, killed under horrible conditions. We had the 1996 or so genocide, Rwanda, Burundi, then Zaire, Congo, where probably 3 million people died hacking each other to death with machetes. We have Iraq, which I brought up. And I keep thinking now, why wasn't I up? We killed 1 million people in Iraq. 1 million people. We did that in our war. And I'm reflecting on my own thinking, why wasn't I similarly gut-wrenched about that as I am? And I was really upset when the photos came out from Abu Ghraib, and I realized how naive I was, because I thought Abu Ghraib was going to lead to a revolution in this country. And it didn't. And then we have Syria, which has had about 500,000 people dead. And Sudan, I don't know, I saw a figure of 150,000 people who've died in this fighting there, and hundreds of thousands of children who were starving to death there. So,
Afghanistan. Do we have numbers?
Sudan, numbers Afghanistan, I don't know, but a lot.
Yeah, you see, that's something.
Right, and we were there for 20 years, right? And we dropped the first mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. So why were we not convulsed? And the fact that we weren't convulsed about these things and people weren't that much in the streets, there was a brief glimmer at the beginning of the Iraq War. That's why the genocide is happening now. That's why they are, quote unquote, getting away with it. Because we were engaged, our government was engaged in one atrocity after the next. And we went along with it. And people voted for people. And you have people like Nancy Pelosi, who isn't run out of town on a rail, who said, oh yeah, well, we all knew at the time that they were lying about weapons of mass destruction, but that's not an impeachable offense. That's what she said about it. So now people are convulsed. And that is probably a good thing, because the people who are convulsed about this now have to take the action to finally stop it. And I am not being cynical when I say this is not the first time that such a genocide has unfolded. It is not. That's not said to make it acceptable. That is said for us to each consider why it took us so long to be emotionally connected to something with it, which we have been participating in over a few generations. And that's the thing that has to change. I strongly believe that mankind can change. I believe that we can have the world that I naively believed I lived in when I was a child, which is that what Adolf Hitler did was a really horrible thing, and thank God we're so much more civilized now, and that's not going to happen. That's what I thought. I got a very rude awakening, which is why I'm doing this. But we have to bring that into being. I believe we can. I believe it's completely necessary. And that is the standpoint from which the Oasis plan, because as I said earlier, when you have the breaking point, and I think we may be at a breaking point, I think the horror that we are seeing may be the thing that pulls the world together and pushes us over the edge, then you have to have the program. And we showed earlier, I just wanted to say a few more things about the Oasis plan, because I did last night my symposium was with this nuclear engineer who also has an engineering PhD in materials. And it was fascinating, and I want to show his proposal. Do you have those slides? Uh-oh.
And also, before we move to this,
Yeah.
we keep forgetting, we do the tally of the victims. We do forget the PTSD and the moral injury of our veterans. And that's even worse, because we're cannibalizing our own.
Sure.
And we don't even think about it.
Right. Yeah. Well, right. I brought up the 22 soldier suicides per day. But I will tell you, while Dave is I shared them with you. I don't know if you see them. Okay. A friend of mine from Iraq was honest enough to tell me about a conversation he had with Lyndon LaRouche. His family fled Iraq, I think, in the first Gulf War in 1990. And he was gut-wrenched and really, really enraged about what the United States was doing to his country. And Mr. LaRouche said to him, "You're right, but understand that the damage that the United States is doing to itself is going to be worse and longer lasting." Yeah. And knowing what we know about these suicides, and for people who, some people know, my sister is a Iraq War veteran who was a brigade surgeon in a combat unit. And her husband was sent on a number of tours. So the suicide question is a big deal, and I knew at the beginning of what the Israelis were doing that you were going to start seeing Israeli soldiers committing suicide, and now that's happening. And Colonel Wilkerson described this also, which is interesting, or it's worth thinking about. He said, look, in combat, which is horrible, because what you're being made to kill other people, which is completely abnormal. My dear friend who's a Vietnam veteran says, I don't know why we have the Geneva Conventions. I mean, once you're killing people, then you're just over that. You've crossed the threshold. Now, of course, it's a good thing we do, but it's true. Once you've crossed that line where you say you can just kill somebody, and in war, who are you killing? It's not the person who made the policy. It's not the person you have an argument with. It's some poor, schmuck who needed money to go to, my sister joined the army to pay for medical school, right? So you join the military and you find yourself there and you're supposed to go kill people or be killed for people or causes that have nothing to do with you. I mean, it's all completely insane. And what Wilkerson was describing is that in combat, the people who are, say, normal to start with develop PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and they end up out of combat. And the longer the battle goes on, the ones who are left are the ones who are not affected by conscience. So that the really hardened, most brutal, torturous killers are the ones then, and that's what I think is happening now in Israel, frankly. You know, and a lot of people are quitting, and a lot of people are burning their draft cards. And again, it's a fascist state, just like Ukraine is. So I do not buy the polls that say 90% of the population supports this. You look at how people are treated by these Zionists in Israel. I don't think we know what people think unless they're extraordinarily courageous, because you'll be beaten up, thrown in jail, whatever, similar to Ukraine. So I think we don't know, and I think what is needed is more people with courage and goodwill, and that people have to pay for their crimes, like what Tulsi Gabbard is uncovering. So back to this, okay. It's the one under the red dot. Yeah. So this is just from the video. People saw this is a schema of LaRouche's plan. 67 borders, but I don't think we're going to get to the 67 borders first. We have to recognize the Palestinian state, and we have to fight for the economic development. And once there is motion that Palestine is recognized and has equal weight, the 67 borders are the last legal framework, but we're going to have to fight. Some people think we won't even end up with two states. I don't know what we'll end up with, but we have to get out of this. So next, that's the UN Resolution 242. That's what it should be. Obviously, the West Bank is much impacted now by the illegal Israeli settlements. How you get those people out of there, or what's to be done about that. Again, there's all kinds of different proposals. But if you don't have water and you don't have electricity, there's nothing that you're going to propose. Next. So this is the program, and this paper, which is 11 pages, and unfortunately I didn't print a bunch, but the engineer who did it really wants people to read it, and he wants their thoughts. So if you can't read it, he said he was inspired by LaRouche's program, so he said, well, let me try and put some numbers on this. How do you actually make it real? And he says, water sources in the Middle East region, red lines represent rivers, cyan areas indicate lakes, and the blue lines mark coastal borders. The map also displays population distribution across the region. Red dots represent large 1,400 megawatt nuclear power plants. Green dots represent small modular reactors. If you go to the next chart, I just blew that up a little so you could see. And what he did was he looked at how much water per capita people use as the primary. He said in Jordan right now, the average per capita water use is only 500 cubic meters per person per year. And I asked, how does that compare with Europe or the United States? I looked it up. The United States is 2,800 cubic meters of water per person per year. France is 3,200 cubic meters per person of water. Per year. And that includes everything. They're just doing it per capita, but that's industry, agriculture, everything. So what he was saying is you basically need 10 times more water than what they have available if you're talking about having a modern economy with electricity, with industry, with agriculture, et cetera, and that the large plants will provide the bulk of the desalination, and the smaller reactors are targeted for specific industry or maybe healthcare facilities or certain residential areas or whatever. Go to the next one. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, so this is just a chart of projected water deficits per country. Next. And this is what he says, each 1,400 megawatt reactor running at a 90% capacity factor generates roughly 11 terawatt hours of electricity per year. He says to get what is needed by his calculations of the water that is needed, he comes to the conclusion that you need 25 nuclear power plants in the region. I think that is so much fun.
These are the medium size.
This is the big ones. Yeah, yeah. That's his conclusion. 25 of those. Next, what do we have next? Oh, this is just the plant at UAE, which is a new nuclear plant, Barbaric. I think it actually has 4 reactors. That's just the first 2. Next. And then he talks about the number of MMRs, which are the small modular reactors, et cetera. Next, we can go on. Now, this was fascinating. Who thinks about what happens to all the salt and everything once you do the desalination? And he said there's so much salt, especially if you're going to take, I don't know if they would take water out of the Dead Sea, for example, which is really, really salty. You're going to have all this salt, and he said you can't just dump it back in the ocean. You're going to offset the, exactly. So look at all these uses of salt, including something I didn't understand, neutron-doped silicon. It needs, in order for it to be able to, I guess, conduct electricity, it can't be pure. You have to put other things in it, and that's called doping. So they want all of these various products, and what he calculated is that here is the revenue that you're going to generate for all of this salt and various products that you're going to be able to use. Salt-based batteries. Anyway, fascinating. Yeah, salt and popcorn. That would be great. Yeah, Andy.
You said that it can't dump the salt back in the ocean, but if not, then isn't that depriving the ocean of its salt? So then it's changing the salinization of the ocean.
Well, the water is that you're desalinating is going into your agriculture and everything else. So I don't think the minuscule amount you're taking out relative to the ocean is probably not going to have that much of an effect. But if you started releasing it all in one location, I think that's where the problem would probably be. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Next. So this is what his estimate. The total cost of the Oasis plan, US $300 billion. Think about what we've spent on Ukraine, right? $300 billion is just a fraction of global military expenditures, which exceeded $2.4 trillion in 2023. It's also equivalent to less than a few years of combined military spending by key Middle Eastern nations. This stark comparison highlights a fundamental choice: continuing to allocate vast resources to war and conflict management, or redirecting them toward a sustainable future that fosters prosperity, cooperation, and long-term stability. Investing in infrastructure and innovation does not just secure water and energy, it secures peace. That's it. We can turn the light. So I just thought this was incredibly exciting. And the other thing he took up, because all of us know, in fact, there was a statement being circulated by a group of people who, in response to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, want to outlaw nuclear weapons. Then they wanted the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche Organization, and others to endorse their statement. But their statement also called for banning nuclear power. And you can't do that. And I asked him about that, and he just said, another thing that I thought was quite fascinating. He said that getting super high enriched uranium for nuclear reactors is like maximum 5% enriched. For a nuclear weapon, you need 93%. And the reactors that we make today don't give you that. And one of the things about the reactors we make, well, the previous generation, not the new ones, we're only using 10% of the potential fuel. If you're getting this uranium product, we use 10%, we get rid of 90% of it as waste. But with the high temperature reactors and breeder reactors, you can use virtually all of it. And when Suzanne and I went to this delightful conference of a group called Nuclear New York, where there were a whole bunch of really, really young people who were all in nuclear engineering, and they were super optimistic and excited. And the first panel was on what you always get, what do you do with the waste? There is a huge new market now for nuclear waste. Everyone wants it because you can reprocess it for the fuel. So this thing that you thought, and it made me laugh because this hysteria, but in this conference where they're looking forward, that's going to be the new growth industry, is who can get the nuclear waste to reuse it for fuel. So it is not easy to make a nuclear weapon from a nuclear power plant. He said, if you want a nuclear weapon, it's a lot easier to just build a centrifuge. He talked about how Pakistan got their nuclear weapons, and he said that there was old technology that was no longer classified. So some Pakistani scientists just got a hold of it and set up the centrifuges, enriched the uranium, and built nuclear bombs. And that it's easier to do that than to build a nuclear power plant. So the idea of saying that nations cannot have nuclear power because they're going to build a nuclear bomb is just completely fallacious to begin with. And he said, and it is the case, and we've seen it by the way that the Anglo-American empire, Wall Street, City of London empire, is conducting itself. We are creating the incentive for people not to desire nuclear power, but to desire the bomb, because you have the first case of Gaddafi in Libya, who agreed to get rid of it, and he got destroyed. And then you have Korea, which refused to give up their capability, and they're still there. Pakistan is still there, right? So the incentive for countries now is that they need nuclear bombs if they're not going to get destroyed. And so it's all backwards. It's all completely backwards. And that's why nothing less than a paradigm change will work. I think the United States has to be a key battleground for this project because of our identity as a revolutionary republic, because of the conception of defeating the British Empire, which is what our nation was based on. And I will say, I've been thinking about this. Part of the reason why people haven't acted more, I think, is because we don't know what our nation is about. So people have this crazy, you hear it, peace through strength. That is not what our nation was founded on. That's just stupid. That's Thrasymachus, virtue is whoever's stronger and can bludgeon the other guy over the head. That is not what our nation was founded to do. That's not what John Quincy Adams. We believed that the American Revolution was going to set a precedent where colonialism on the planet would die. And how many Americans think of that as our idea? So it was actually an idea of goodwill, which would be fostered not by strength, but by economic relations and exchanges like the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia, that was how colonialism would be ended. But in order to do that, our nation had to perfect itself, had to continue along the path of becoming a better republic with everyone equally and fairly represented, and then the world would change accordingly.
You thought colonialism would be ended because of all the statements in our founding documents? You make statements all the time about how America promotes democracy around the world. Why believe it then any more than we believe it now?
But people weren't saying that then. The Centennial Exhibition is the perfect example. What did we do? We had this gigantic fair. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed. And what actually blew people away was that the average Joe in Philadelphia had indoor plumbing. There was a higher standard of living in the United States than anywhere in Europe and in all kinds of other places. So people came here and they said, oh, maybe we should build the Transcontinental Railroad. It was by example of actually doing something, as opposed to running around making ridiculous, meaningless statements based on nothing. Yeah. Oh, God. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make two points. One about colonialism, and and the other one is about the kind of like promoting a robust peace rhetoric. Now, let me start with the second, with the peace rhetoric, because the way any peace and anti-war movement has been undercut in the United States is from this fear-mongering. It was the communist time, it was the Reds, blah, blah, blah. Now it's China, before it was like the terrorists, the Islamist terrorists. So they always have a narrative. So the deep state always has a narrative to scaremonger the American people into going along, if not willingly participating and contributing to the imperial projects that the federal government is doing. So in order to counter that, we need to actually attack the main vilification and demonization narrative against, for example, China. I think the LaRouche Organization is probably famous for actually being a bulwark against scaremongering against the Chinese, but we need to do that also for North Korea. We need to do it for Iran. We need to do it for all these kind of convenient enemies that are used as the boogeyman every time they want to embark on a new military project, like Russia, you know. And you illustrated how they started that already when Trump unexpectedly and surprisingly won the 2016 election on that premise. Now, the second point is on colonialism. So colonialism is primarily domestic. The first victims of colonialism, and that goes back to the English imperialism. Mm-hmm. The prime victims of the English imperialism was the domestic English population. Sure, they were elevated, you know, they got crumbs out of these riches that they acquired by the colonial project, and that was the ruse, that was the deception. And the same is happening with the American people right now, and we see it patently. One example is the cannibalism towards our veteran and our military population. But then again, the open border, the open border drug trafficking. We have 150,000 people like dying every year from drugs that are on government facilities, and they open the border and they preach to us anti-China, but at the same time they open the gates from the south border to have the Chinese manufactured fentanyl being peddled by the Mexican cartels and wreak havoc on the inner cities and the rural areas of the United States. So you see, so colonial, and we have to realize that. We think, oh, we are colonialists because we went into something in Africa and we got a mine over there and we mine. Yes, that's colonialism, but see, the domestic population does not benefit from that economic.
Right.
So we need to realize that first. And then, so it's these two things, the scaremongering and the domestic impact. Mm-hmm.
There's another, but Jose, do you want to say something?
Well, I had
Go ahead.
just some reflections and a question, if you want to take it. I don't know, you didn't formally announce a Q&A, but I mean, if you...
Have we announced the Q&A?
We should take questions now.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, what?
So,
Oh, Alvin is... Alvin wants to say...
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and then you go.
FDR was referenced earlier by Dennis, but I think with some of the things that I'm hearing, it's worth looking back on what he did and that type of leadership, which did move a nation, which did save the world. Of course, as we all know, unfortunately, the great man died, the small one came into place, and Dennis was referencing this when we talk about British intelligence and their very good knack at, the manipulation and choosing how to lead mind. But that principle, we've been to the museum, the FDR museum several times, and have had many discussions on it. His being struck with polio, as I understand it, I believe Lynn referenced this, gave him a chance to re-examine his own historical roots and that relationship between his, I guess, great-great-grandfather and Alexander Hamilton. So the war, as he saw it, would be ending clearly, as his son wrote, ending colonialism. So this was a great moment. The next great moment that was lost was 1989. That was the turning point. I would have been born some 12 years after his death. And as one who got all but destroyed by the counterculture of that time in the late 60s, early 70s, my life would have been different, as would tens of millions of others, particularly the darkies in the United States. And the work of Martin Luther King and Malcolm would have been ennobled because a shift would have occurred economically, and we would not have been dragged into Vietnam. So it was principle, not rules, not laws, not law, and action that FDR, I mean, to me, along with Lincoln, these two men are worth studying and seeing what they had to endure and sacrifice so that this great experiment might endure.
As the analyst, do you have anything you want to say?
Well,
And how say?
There's a lot of things going on here. So let me just say a few things.
Okay.
First of all, this question about domestic colonialism is crucial because we wrote a book which got us in a lot of trouble. It's called Dope Incorporated. It was written because of the Carter administration, because we saw what was going on with the Carter administration, which was promoting the legalization of drugs, but it was promoting the legalization of drugs because it was promoting deregulation in general. So it wasn't merely the drug process. That was something that was coming not from Carter personally, it came from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who we are still haunted by because of 9/11, among other things. But it was Brzezinski, of course, and Brzezinski's the Afghanistan policy. The drug policy was the change was run by Kissinger and Brzezinski. Now, both of them had been at Harvard together with William Yandell Elliott. Kissinger's speech on May 10th, 1982, in which he specifically says he, as Secretary of State, agreed with the policy of Churchill and not the policy of Roosevelt. That Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State, did not agree with Franklin Roosevelt's put down of Winston Churchill and his notion that America was going to make the world better rather than Churchill's idea, which is that he was going to reestablish the colonies of the British Empire right after the war. Churchill died, Roosevelt died, Churchill did not. That's what he did with the help of Truman. And the drug process, which was brought into the United States, in part as a counter to what you just were talking about around the civil rights movement. It was not only for that purpose, but it was largely for that purpose. And it aimed at what I talked about much earlier, a lot of people weren't here, about the lower 50% of the population. The half of the population in the United States is to just be wiped out, period. I mean, these are policies that these people had from 1974, stated National Security Study Memorandum 200, which talks about population reduction for 15 countries in various parts of the world. But that stuff was really about the United States as well. Speaking about veterans, to talk about this for a minute, there's a man by the name of Charles Teddington. He was an American veteran. He was, at the time, the most decorated non-commissioned veteran. This is back in mid-70s. We met him. He went up and met with LaRouche at one point. 1979, he met him. And he discussed how he had been brought back from Vietnam and had been put into a series of special briefings in and around the Pentagon. And in one of those briefings, where there was he brought into a discussion, and there were, this would have been occurring about this discussion about 72, 73. And he was involved with these discussions with special units, special forces units associated with Pentagon. And when he left, he was puzzled about something, and he said, we're talking about occupation of buildings, which are high-rises. They don't have those in Vietnam. And he said, and the response was, no, we were discussing Detroit. So people who know the House Un-American Activities Committee reports from March of 1968, which is not many people, I happen to know it, guerrilla warfare in the United States, there's a whole discussion about occupying parts of the United States militarily, controlling them. If you think what you're seeing in what you're calling the border and ICE has to do with the border and ICE, I don't know, I can say you a couple of bridges. Please, everybody, understand what has happened. As of 9/11, you have not been living in the United States. You haven't been. I'm not blaming you, I'm saying that's what happened. We have to get the United States back. And when you get anybody, let's take Donald Trump, who simply is not part of that schema. People want to say, well, Trump is this problem, the other problem. Yeah, but he's not part of that. He's not Bush. He's not Cheney. He's not Bush 43. He's not Biden. He's not Obama. All of that is the same thing, by the way. Particularly Obama. That's just the black Bush, like Dave Chappelle said.
He predicted the black Bush.
That's just what that is. See, so it doesn't mean that you can't, there aren't differentiations you can make here. But this colonialism thing is critical because the drug process, well, back when we wrote the book initially, it was $150 billion a year. By now, by the last time we wrote it 4 times. We had to keep doing revisions, right? Because it kept getting worse. We got up to like $1 trillion in drug traffic. It's probably closer to 2 now, internal to the United States and related to the United States itself. The United States is no longer an industrial nation. People, we all know this. Look around us, look at these places. Look at what we're in, right? You feel like Neo when Morpheus says to him, yeah, you think it's 1999. Let me tell you what it really looks like. Okay, then you turn around and you can't. That's what you're in. It's like I told you at the time, when The Matrix, I think it was a great movie, but I say it's more like a documentary. You know? Well, it is. I'm not recommending The Matrix. I'm saying something different. So I just think we just want to realize that we have a problem, a set of problems we can solve. Those of us who face the truth. And Diane, in her campaigns, Jose doing other campaigns, you know, we had this person that many of us got to know very well, Lyndon LaRouche. He's not well known now to a lot of people, but those of us who knew him, now we never forget him. We can't forget him, okay? Yeah. He cursed us, right? And because he was this person who would stand up when nobody else would say what people thought was outrageous, but we actually would end up being not only true, but it's something that you should have known yourself. You should have already known it. You should have been doing something about it. And so one final thing about, just to respond, not to start a fight, the United States is not a democracy. Democracy is an evil thing, people. Yeah. It's not evil because people have the right to vote, no. But this notion, hey, you know, lynch mobs are democratic.
Right.
Okay? It's just that the guy getting lynched doesn't get a majority. Okay? So just to understand, okay, that's what happened to Socrates. He was lynched by the Democratic Party of Athens. No, we are a republic. And we are a republic for a reason. And the issue is trying to keep the republic. And in the republic, here's what happens. The citizens are given the right, under both the preamble of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, actually given an admonition by the Declaration of Independence, that whenever the government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations upon such principles and organizing its institutions in such form as to them shall be fit to, secure their security and happiness.
The country is not governed by the preamble at all. It's governed by the Constitution.
Actually, that's not true. That's a choice. King didn't think that, see? So he thought it was really about the Constitution, and he thought it really was about the Declaration of Independence. And he really thought it was about the image of Lincoln, which is why when he did the speech in front of the memorial, that's why people related to it the way they did. People want to talk about the extraordinary rhetorical flourishes. That's true. But that's not why people related to it. He started by saying, 50 years ago, a great American in whose shadow we stand today. That's how he began. That was one of the great dramatic performances of human history. When I say dramatic performance, what I mean is it was Grecian, just like in the Pantheon. In the same way, the Greek trauma was created. Greek trauma was created to defeat the Persians at Marathon. That was the purpose of the dramas. They knew 10 years before they went to war, they were going to fight the Persians. And they knew they couldn't beat them. And the reason they couldn't beat them is because the people believed in gods that had been given to them by the Delphic oracles. And so for 10 years, Aeschylus and a bunch of people that we no longer know, we only have 8 of his plays, wrote plays and dramas to try to get the Greeks off their crazy fantasies. It was words, yes, words, listen to me, words that changed people. And that's what qualified them to beat the Athenians at Marathon. The Spartans never got there. The Spartans refused to come because they were having a religious ceremony. So the tough guy machos weren't there. It was the airy-fairy Athenians that went down and kicked the hell out of the Persians because they were poets, because they were dramatists, because they understood words. And it is words that change the world.
Jose.
No kidding.
Jose,
Yeah.
please. Others. Oh, yes, take the microphone.
I had gotten some responses from people who are watching the live stream right now, but I kind of wanted to preamble it first because some of us have been working on LaRouche's discovery, like this paper that he published in 1994, I believe, after he was visited by some Russian economists while he was in prison. And it's a pretty dense paper because he starts talking about people like Leibniz, Cusa, he starts talking about George Cantor, Riemann, right? And so if you don't have somebody like a Jason Ross or a Megan DeBroe with you, you can be pretty lost. So I'm pretty grateful that they're there with us. But one of the things that he talks about, right? And he's an economic forecaster, and he's talking about geometry. And one of the things that he talks about is Cusa and Leibniz's idea of like a circle, because you can't actually define a circle just on the merit of it being like a circle. And there used to be a thing, or there's this talk, right, that like, well, is a circle just composed of infinite angles, right? So if you have a square that's 4 sides, then you add a side that's a pentagon. And then you go on and so forth. Can you infinitely add many sides until it creates a circle? Well, you could have 9,999 sides. It's still not a circle, right? So the circle is actually something that's defined outside of it. And you can only know it by circular action. Like, you know you can make a circle by doing something that's circular. And that ideas are the same way too. They're not composed of little things that make up a big thing, but rather it's something that comes from the outside in. And that's also his proof for God. Anyway, the reason I started thinking about this more in relation to the presentation that you gave in particular, and a little bit about what Dennis went through though, is because you started talking about the settlers. And the reactions I got from people were like, wait, why did Diane just say, we're just going to figure out what to do with the settlers at some point? Because you said, oh, there's been some proposals anyway, let's move on. That's what they told me. And at first I shared their reaction, but then it's like, well, wait a minute, but there's like this beautiful plan that you have of a vision for humanity. Why get stuck on the little details? But that being said, Diane, you did run for Senate, and I am running for Congress, and it is a question we will get. What do you do with the settlers? There was just a documentary that came up a few months ago called The Settlers, and in it, I forget the name, Louis Theroux, right? That's the guy's name. He just got to go to where these settlements are, and he's interviewing people like Daniela Weiss, who, you know, they call her like the mother of the settlers over there, and they're just taking this land. They don't care. And then Israel then recognizes the settlements and then adds that to the land.
Well, they just voted to annex it.
Right, well, it's non-binding, to be fair.
Well, it can't be binding, but anyway.
But my point is, it's like, you know, I think kind of trying to take it up a notch, it's like, you know, the squad, the progressives in the Congress like to say they're anti-war, but they have no problem sending money and weapons to Ukraine. You know, so clearly they're not anti-war, they're just anti-provoking war, I guess. But, you know, so what do you do in that situation? What do you do with the settlers? I mean, you know, I haven't read enough LaRouche to know what he would think, but I do know there are documents where he has talked about he's not anti-violence, or at least the strategic use of it. You know, he actually did talk about the need for a well-trained, classically trained army composed of people who have an idea of building cities, you know, and being classical men of statescraft. But anyway, I'm just putting that out there. And I wanted to put that preamble there as a first to say, I do think it's kind of absurd to say, well, wait a minute, we can't move on with this beautiful stuff until we figure out what to do with the settlers. But at the same time, it's like, is it something you can just move past? Like, you have to know how to answer that, no? Or at least have some, anyway.
Want me to say something?
May I get a crack at it before you do? And then...
Oh, my gosh.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
So the answer about the whole problem, the Israel-Palestine problem, lies in the foundational United Nations resolution, the 1947 resolution. That resolution, which by the way, Israel used it to say, well, we had the resolution that the United States previewed our creation, and then we're going to go ahead and do it anyways. However, that resolution was very clear and unambiguous. Either there are going to be two states created simultaneously or none at all. So based on the foundational United Nations resolution, that basically it was a discussion, it was not a mandate that it has to be partitioned along those lines. No, it was a point of discussions, and you know the Arab states didn't want it, and you know and rightfully so. So based on that very initial resolution, Israel is illegitimate. Okay. Now, of course, they went into a whole campaign of corruption and arm twisting of politicians across the decades to get illicit recognitions by the corresponding governments, right? But that doesn't make them legitimate, because if we keep the rhetoric right, then governments are going to start rescinding their recognition of a state that has devolved into a genocidal, worse than Jim Crow apartheid state. All right? Now, that's why the point, what Dennis said about words, that's how you win, with words. Now, and let's table the United Resolution of 1947, right? Now, you knew that Israel had many settlements in Gaza, in the similar way that they keep doing the Swiss cheese out of the Palestinian, the unoccupied Palestinian territories. They did that in Gaza, and in 2005 they left Gaza. They left Gaza, but of course they kept it under siege. Okay, and when they left Gaza, they demolished all the buildings that they had made, because God forbid something is going to benefit the Palestinians. So a similar process could happen that way, but let me take it one point further. If you say everybody keeps to insinuate and assume that there have to be two states. God forbid, no, one state. Under one state, and people say, oh my God, how they're going to coexist? They're going to coexist the same way Palestinians and Zionists coexist in the good and the God-forsaken United States of America. So if Trump, going back to his, I think, intentionally ridiculous proposal to do the ethnic cleansing, which surprisingly, all the Trump deranged syndrome patients, they didn't jump on him to lynch him on what he said. Nobody criticized him on that. The most outrageous thing that we're going to do, ethnic cleansing. And silence, okay. Now, but that opens the door that the United States can go in and, like they pulled the ear of Netanyahu and he accepted his defeat by Hamas, and now we have that quasi-ceasefire where they do passive-aggressive crimes by killing people on the breadline. Basically, he told them to stop. Biden could have told them to stop 1 month after the October 7th, because at that time the Israelis, within a month, they ran out of ammunition, okay? And Biden told them, listen, you guys are going too heavy. I'm not going to give you weapons. And then there was a little pause in the killing of the making by Netanyahu, and then they resumed. What does that say? That the United States can very well impose a one-state solution. I'm not saying it has to be the 51st state. Canada has that position, by the way. I'm joking, sorry. I'm not saying to make it the 51st state, but the United States definitely has the heavy hand to say, you guys are going to be one state, and we're going to make sure you operate in the way any other American state does. You're going to love each other. And if you want to like segregate, you segregate from each other. I mean, we have segregation in the United States even to this day. So there are many ways to deal with the problem without. My first choice would be the one state, because that's what it's supposed to be. One state. If not, go back to the 1947 partition plan, but that, not the 1967. And another final point, Obama made a big, quote-unquote, gift to Netanyahu on his way out in 2016. What happened in 2016 that there's still a gag order? We talk about the Epstein list, but the one thing that we should be asking about disclosure from our deep state is Stuxnet. I don't know, how many people have heard of Stuxnet? Stuxnet, yes. That was the computer virus which meant to destroy industrial systems, and that was the initial plan to destroy Iran's nuclear industrial infrastructure. And actually it did start working, but then the Israelis were not patient. And they were trying to force the Americans, let's do it more aggressive, so we can have a big blowout of there. And the Americans were saying no. And Netanyahu did it, they did it on their own. That was the big scandal. Obama was extremely pissed off at Netanyahu, and his payback was at the 2016 United Nations Security Council, where there was a resolution to declare any post-1967 territory, including those the Swiss cheese settlements that acquired, declared these illegal. Such resolutions have been tried to be passed for years, and the United States always vetoed. That time, of course, Obama did not vote against Israel, but that the decision was passed 14-0 with the United States abstaining. So legally, diplomatically, all these territories are illegally kept by Israel as we speak. So there are these fundamental elements. We have to start articulate them and disseminate them. And then I think people are going to fall in the right place.
Gotta go. Yeah, we have to end.
We have to end, but since Jose asked me, I'm going to say what I think about this. We have not recognized the Palestinian state. The settlements are in what is part of Palestine. So there has to be a Palestinian state recognized, and it is for that Palestinian state to decide what is to be done, and those people who think they are in Israeli settlements are going to find themselves in Palestine. First of all, that is what has to happen. And that's why I said we don't know ultimately if we will end up with 2 states or 1 state, but I would imagine after the atrocities that have been perpetrated, it is not for the United States to come in and say, you are going to live in 1 state together, forget it. So the fact that after all these years and even after the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian people have not been given sovereignty over their own land or the right to make their decisions as they see fit is the first thing that has to be addressed. But otherwise, I will take a page from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is that none of this is possible if the world doesn't move into a new paradigm. One of the things that Lyndon LaRouche said before he passed away, which was very jarring to many of us, is that, and he has been, to be clear, was one of the biggest defenders of national sovereignty anywhere. And if you look at Helga's 10 principles, the first one is sovereignty. But he said mankind ultimately will get to a place where the sovereignty of your nation is not the final way that human life is organized. Now, when do we get there? What does it look like? Does that mean eradicating all language, cultures, and religions and having one horrible homogenous blob? I don't think so. But what does it look like if we are building colonies on Mars? What does it look like if we figure out how to get out of the solar system? Then suddenly this Earth is going to be very, very tiny, and maybe we're going to relate to each other as Earthlings and not as, you know, this country, that country. So I think we have to have in mind that ultimately that's where we're going. We have to address the injustice that the Palestinian people have not had a state and had been given the right to represent themselves and determine what they're doing. In that case, these people will find themselves living in Palestine, and then, you know, they will have to decide what they do about it. I've read very interesting proposals. I was not aware that Belgium has like 4 different governments. You know, I mean, yeah, all different. They have a government for the different languages, each of the different languages. So there are proposals afloat for Palestinian and Israeli states that occupy the same land area, but have different there's all kinds of things. But if you don't address the fundamental injustice and you don't make sure that people have running water, electricity, a decent education, health care, we can make up whatever political construct we want. It's not going to mean anything.
Yeah.
Because we have a limitation. Yeah, time, please. I want to thank Diane for what she's did and also what Harley did. And I want to thank everybody for, of course, coming, and see you the next time we do this, which we think is going to be rather soon. So.